Well, I said to Nico earlier that this whole recount thing is kind of like an Abbott and Costello movie I saw once where Costello's telling, actually Abbott is telling Costello to pack a suitcase, and he tells him to unpack it. And as he keeps changing his mind about whether they're leaving town, pack it, unpack it, pack it, unpack it. It reminds me of what's going on with this recount. Do it, don't do it. And so all these clerks and volunteers, they start counting, then they stop. They start counting, and then they stop. Well, I guess we've stopped now. Peter Wielhouwer, professor of political science at Western Michigan University, is back with us to try and decipher what the heck's been going on. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Richard.
Pack that suitcase, unpack it. I just can imagine how this thing is going. You get going and you stop, you get going, you stop. To say nothing of the huge effort that was underway to just get it coordinated. But all this time, I've been trying to figure out what the motivation is here, and I see some nuances of what the motivation might be. What do you say it is?
Well, when we look at so the motivation for the recount, in my best read of it, first of all, taking Jill Stein at her word that she knows she can't win, and so she wanted to ensure the integrity of the electoral process. Okay, that actually seems like a reasonable thing to say.
Uh-huh.
As it turns out, the recount has revealed a lot of problems with the way that the processing of votes, particularly over in Wayne County. We have lots of examples of this, but in places where the recount wasn't really well recorded yet, we don't know what discrepancies there are. Problems with the way that we're counting votes and the way that our machines work and so forth. So I think that, the more scurrilous kind of assumption is that she's trying to undermine the legitimacy of the election outcome generally. Certainly Republicans would say that she's just trying to make things look worse for Donald Trump, weaken his position, weaken the mandate that he's claiming. So, you've got kind of the prima facie reasonable argument, and then you've got kind of what's really between the lines.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so in Michigan, at least, the notion is that if you want to recount, there has to be some underlying possibility that the outcome would be different than we think it is. And in her case, it isn't.
Well, I think my understanding of the way state law works is, in this case, is that the candidate who thinks that that the outcome would be different and that they would be affected by it, that's the person who has standing to sue for the recount.
Okay.
So Hillary Clinton lost Michigan, according to the original count, by about 10,700 votes. Under state law, there's an automatic recount if the difference is 2,000 votes. But, that's a really small number of votes for an election in which we had 4.8 million cast. In fact, the 10,700 vote difference is 0.2% difference between Trump and Clinton. And so it doesn't legally meet the standard. But I think actually Hillary Clinton actually did have standing to sue for a Michigan recount and probably would have been justified in doing so because it was so close.
Mm-hmm.
But the courts ruled that Jill Stein, because she had so many fewer votes that she had no hope of winning, that she did not have the legal standing to call for the recount.
So if Hillary doesn't want to recount, why does Jill Stein?
Well, I can't speak to that and beyond what I said already.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a little puzzling to me that Hillary Clinton didn't want to recount in Michigan, unless she just was said I'm just done with this.
Uh-huh, right.
I think for the history books, I think it makes sense. Let's get an accurate count of what the Michigan public actually voted when we've got some pretty good evidence of little discrepancies, but over a widespread area. When you're talking about 10,000 votes and really only 5,000 votes to split to make a decision, you could be really talking about something important here.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer is with us, and in that regard, as Peter has alluded, there have been some discrepancies, some problems that have been unveiled in this process in Michigan, and maybe we need election reform. We'll talk about that in just a minute on WBCK. Peter Wielhouwer spoke with us at various points during the run-up to the election, and today we're talking about this whole recount business. So should we I mean, are experts alarmed at some of the things that this effort has uncovered in Michigan, as far as you can tell?
Well, I think most of the experts are not really alarmed, nor are they really surprised. So there are a couple of things. My understanding is that the state elections director, Chris Brown, has been trying to lobby for some fundamental election reform over the last several years, and he's really tried to propose some things, and the legislature really hasn't been receptive to widespread revisiting the way our election systems work. I heard an interview last night with a lawyer on the Democratic side who said that over the long haul, that the last time that Michigan's fundamental election law was really changed and updated was in the 1950s. And that was kind of, he argued, and I don't know if this is the case, but he argued that it was a marginal tweak to an 1870s law. So if that's the case, it may be that really we need to revisit as a state how we want our elections to function. And there are a couple of there's some low-hanging fruit here, right? So one of these is the recount, the mandatory recount. Under Michigan law, there's a mandatory recount at 2,000 votes. But when that number was set, that was set a long time ago when Michigan's population was much smaller. Normally, states have mandatory recounts when the difference is 0.5%, and our election result here was 0.2%. So I think that's low-hanging fruit in terms of saying when can we trigger a mandatory recount.
Yeah. Okay. What about some of the things that were uncovered in Wayne County where numbers just didn't match up and things like that? To you, what does that say? We just have poorly trained election workers, or what's happening there?
So there are a couple of things. First of all, the state law in terms of when a precinct can qualify for a recount is this situation. That when you have the poll book, which is the list of people who voted and the count of the number of people who showed up in line, you've got that list and a number associated with that list. And then you've got the number of ballots in the tabulating machines. So you've got the number of ballots in the bins, and you've got the number of people who showed up to vote, and those numbers have to match.
Okay.
When those numbers match, you can do a recount. When the numbers don't match, you can't do a recount. So ironically, in precincts where there are clear counting errors somewhere in the process, you can't go back and back-check those precincts, according to state law.
Seems odd.
Whereas precincts where they've got their accounting right, those are the places where you can go back and recount. So there's some kind of it's a counterintuitive thing, and the underlying assumption seems to be that if everything works fine on election night, the underlying assumption seems to be that any discrepancy has to have occurred after election night. But what we're finding is lots of errors and problems on election night. So now most of these people who are doing this are probably working in good faith, right? There doesn't seem to be a nefarious effort underway. Simple things like there was a ballot container that the seal broke, and so they fixed it with duct tape. Well, now you can't recount those set of ballots. Mm-hmm. When you've got a broken ballot bin, you can't recount that. Sometimes people who are recording the voters, they skipped a line in the ballot box accidentally, in the ballot book accidentally, so that led to the number of lines being incorrect.
I see.
You had machines that were not functioning correctly. So you've got a bin in the machine, you put the ballot in the machine, and instead of the ballot going into the bin, it kind of slipped down the back. And so you've got one precinct, it's precinct 152 in Detroit. You've got 307 people who voted, but only 50 of the ballots in that tabulating machine ended up in the actual bin. And later on, they found those ballots in the bottom of the machine, but now you can't recount that thing. So you've got all these little things that add up. My understanding from reporting is that the vast majority of these precincts where there are differences, it's off by one ballot. So you've got one ballot difference between the poll book and the number of ballots. And most of that seems to be, you can account for that simply by they ran a test ballot, and that somehow got included in the count.
Wow. Okay, so if there is going to be election reform, I think your notion here is things like discrepancies then prohibiting a recount, the counterintuitive part to which you referred, would need to be looked at and changed.
Right. It seems to me that if you've got a discrepancy, that screams for the recount.
Right.
rather than prohibiting it. So let's get it straight.
We're talking with Professor Peter Wielhouwer about this whole recount business. We'll also talk in just a moment about the notion of the Electoral College and all the chatter going on with whether or not that's going to survive. And we'll talk about that in just a second. WBCK with Peter Wielhouwer this half hour as we talk about the recount. So, election reform, it seems like we're begging for it here. It doesn't get changed much. Somebody's going to have to take the lead on that. You see that happening. Has it started?
No, I don't think so. I think you've got probably folks on the Democratic side who are more inclined to want to push election reform now because of the problems. Under the current system, however, for whatever its flaws, the Republicans are winning. So it's really hard to get people who are currently winning under any system to be highly motivated to change the system. Mm-hmm. But it does seem to me that we've got enough simple human mechanical errors, simple principle errors such as the discrepancy issue here, that it seems like this is really something that ought to be pretty straightforward in terms of a bipartisan effort to just kind of update our election process.
Right, and we'll see if it can rise above the politics and get to that
I really
point.
Hope so.
This federal judge last night saying, okay, the Michigan recount needs to stop, and it does. Evidently, Jill Stein says she'll appeal that. And one of the arguments I read from her attorneys, and I'm paraphrasing, but it basically said, how can the president-elect who claimed all along that the process was flawed now want to block that?
That is one of the many ironies of the statements of our president-elect, to be sure.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see if that holds any water going forward as a way to try and motivate any sort of reform discussion or anything in that regard. We talked with Dr. Joe Schwartz a while ago, who, of course, Battle Creek former mayor and former congressman and so on, teaches public policy at University of Michigan and the Gerald R. Ford School. He sat here and said, listen, the Electoral College is going to go away, probably not now, but eventually. Do you share that viewpoint?
I think it's unlikely, simply because to get rid of the Electoral College as an institution requires a constitutional amendment, and it's just extraordinarily difficult to get those amendments passed through Congress and then through the state legislatures. What seems more likely to me are reform efforts that leverage the Electoral College to, in a way that basically makes the results guaranteed to be equal to the popular vote. There are a couple of different proposals on how to make that work. That seems to be much more likely, using the current system rather than trying to scrap the current system. It's just too difficult, and there aren't enough people motivated in Congress to get a constitutional amendment on abolishing the Electoral College through. I just don't see that happening.
Mm-hmm. But if I heard you, a reform effort to guarantee the outcome be equal to the popular vote can somehow coexist with the Electoral College?
Yes. So how states allocate their Electoral College votes is completely up to the states. There's no federal law about this. It's not in the Constitution. It's completely up to the state legislature. So there's an organization called Fair Vote, and they've been going to state legislatures around the country, and I think they've succeeded in 11 states so far. And their argument is that it's a good idea for the state to allocate their Electoral College votes so that whatever the popular vote is nationwide, our state will allocate our Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins the national popular vote. And then there's a trigger mechanism so that they're not just doing it unilaterally, but when you have enough states to hit that 270 mark that you need in the Electoral College to win, that's the trigger that would cause these laws to become effective. So that uses the Electoral College system, but it leverages it in such a way that you also take into account that states get to decide how they're going to do their Electoral College
I see.
votes.
And that still preserves whatever concerns the writers of the Constitution had as it relates to concerns about the voting and the Electoral College and so on. The purpose of the Electoral College stays preserved.
Well, I don't think the purpose of the Electoral College actually is working the way the framers of the Constitution originally intended. When we look at their writings at the time, the purpose was that the states would elect these kind of independent, wise men who would then take the national interest into account and choose the best guy for the job. I mean, and back then, I'm not using sexist language, it was the guys, right? So we're not talking about women being part of the equation at this time. And what they didn't think about was the emergence of mass political parties the way we have them now. They didn't exist at the founding era. So by the 1830s, when mass political parties emerge, then the people who get picked for the Electoral College, they basically turn out to be party loyalists. They're chosen simply because they're going to vote for the party's candidate. And so you kind of short-circuit the original vision of the way that the electors would function. And so they're voting out of party loyalty now rather than out of kind of dispassionate what's the country's best interest. So the fair vote basically has a different assumption, which is that majority must rule all the time. And that's also a different assumption than the framers had.
Very interesting. So let that sink in, and we'll talk to you again soon, Peter.
Okay, thanks very much.
Professor Peter Wielhouwer in the Poli-Sci Department at Western Michigan University.